Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Spiritual Meaning Behind the Hebrew Alphabets. These are ancient truths for modern times. I am Pastor Ed Anderson, broadcasting live out of Phoenix, Arizona. We have been on an amazing journey studying the spiritual meaning behind the pictograms of each of the Hebrew alphabet. Many people, and I'm going to be talking more about this next week, but many people don't realize that the Hebrew language is really three different languages. You have the pictograms, which is symbolic of a meaning. It's very similar to hieroglyphics. And then you have the numeric language, which every one of these Hebrew alphabets has a numeric meaning, which is tied in some significant way to a spiritual meaning as well. And then, of course, you have the spoken aspect of the Hebrew language, which is the oldest language in the world today. So the Hebrew language is very fascinating. For those of us today in 2020s, it's a language that many people have forgot about. The Israelites or the Jews still look at this language, but even today, a lot of the spiritual meaning behind the Hebrew alphabets were lost through time. So we've been very fortunate to take a look at all of these Hebrew alphabets, which up to this point we have covered 21 of these Hebrew alphabets. Today we are going to be looking at the final Hebrew alphabet, the 22nd Hebrew alphabet, which is the Tav. And this is assigned, or you will find this over Psalm 119 verse 169 through 176. Now again, just by way of what we're going to be doing, I'll talk tonight about the Tav, and then next week we are going to be pulling it all together. We're going to be taking a look at all of the 22 Hebrew alphabets very quickly, from Aleph all the way through to Tav, and we're going to be talking about the story that it creates, and you do not want to miss next week, because without realizing it, many people lost the macro message that God was giving us through the spiritual meaning behind each of the Hebrew alphabets. And it is a golden thread. It's a gigantic secret that's revealed when you take a look at all the Hebrew alphabet pulled together, and you stand back at 30,000 feet and you look at it and you say, wow, I had no idea. So next week we're going to be doing that for you as a way of concluding this series, spiritual meaning behind the Hebrew alphabets. After that, we will begin a brand new series, so I'll talk a little bit more about that. But just to give you some insight, we are going to be looking at the 7 feasts and the 7 festivals in the Old Testament, and why those different feasts and different festivals are important for Christians today. Are they important? And if so, what spiritual meaning is behind each one, and what did Jesus have to say about it, or how did Jesus deal with it? So we're going to be looking at that when we're done with this particular series, but we're not there yet. Tonight we're going to be looking at the Tav. So let's go ahead and dig right into this. Tav is the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. It is the 22nd letter, and the pictogram literally means mark. Okay, when you see the pictogram of the Tav, the picture that you get is a sign or a seal, almost a signature that God uses. It's a mark of God. Okay, it is the symbol of truth, because God is truth. It is a symbol of perfection, so a sign, a mark, a seal of perfection, because God is the one that endorsed it. God's name is on it. God's mark is on it. Therefore, it is perfect. And in a larger, broader sense, it is a signet or a seal, a mark of completion. In other words, you've gone through this journey, and now you've come to the completion of that journey's end. The Tav represents the restoration of all of existence, all creation, where it may have been less than perfect or may have fallen short of expectation. The Tav represents this restoration back to perfection, okay? And it returned really to the essence and purpose of human life. In other words, where we might be a ship drifting on this massive ocean, we have finally made it to port. If we are using birds in flight, okay, on this long journey, we have finally found our resting place, our nesting place. It is the completion of that journey, okay? So Tav is very symbolic of this mark, this signet, the seal, the symbol of God, and it also represents this completion of a journey, okay? So it represents a type of new beginning, okay? So as you come to this completion, you begin a brand new journey. We're going to be talking a little bit more about that in just a minute, but the original intent of God was to have a creation, human life, brought into perfect stature, perfect image of who God is. And so the Tav is symbolic of humankind brought back into that status of perfection the way God had originally intended it. The Tav also shows that the end was set from the very beginning. In other words, remember, the Hebrew language was actually given by God, and so the very fact that this pictogram symbolizes that you've come to a journey's end, but you're about ready to start something completely new, indicates that there was a plan of salvation that God had intended from the very beginning, should mankind fall away, or should mankind choose to walk down a pathway that would be not in conformity to what God had intended for us, okay? So in a really small way, Tav implies that the very end of that journey was already set from the beginning. It's not predestination. It's not that at all. It's the option of that God set in motion, a plan. In case humanity would deviate, there would be a plan in action that would bring mankind back into alignment, okay? So it is the idea that God set in this motion certain actions and events, certain things on his behalf in order to reach this final state of balance, okay? And humankind was that sort of that pivot point where good and evil kind of balanced on, okay? This cosmic struggle between good and evil, Christ and Satan, hinged on this fact of this plan where humanity was sort of the pawn in the center of that, or was the pivot point for that. Okay, well, the Tav is saying that God set in motion actions that would put things back into balance, okay? It is the completion of that reality, a completion of truth, a completion of God's intent, okay? So that's the Tav. It's a mark. It's a sign. It shows completeness. Okay, now, that being said, however, as soon as that Tav is reached, as soon as the end is reached, like I mentioned earlier, this also symbolizes this aspect that you're going to be continuing to walk connected to the Lord. You're in that temple place of God. You're walking hand in hand. It is now closed. You're now walking hand in hand with God. You're in the household of God. And now God is going to take you on this awesome brand new journey, okay, that immediately begins right after you've come to the conclusion of what we're experiencing right now, okay? So in other words, you're circling back to the very beginning of Aleph, and the very beginning of the Hebrew alphabet, okay, which is the source of everything. As we discovered, God was the source of all things. Mankind was the receiver of God's goodness, and it was Christ that connected God and mankind together. Okay, so here we see that there's a prophecy, almost, so to speak, that you can look forward to something that's coming in the future that we haven't reached yet, because none of us are perfect yet, okay? So this is telling you that there's going to come a point when God is going to end this imbalance. He's going to restore mankind, and as soon as we are restored and say we're brought to heaven, and now we're one with God, and we're one with, as Revelation points out, these 24 elders, and there's a lot of praise, there's worship going on in heaven, and a new Jerusalem, a new earth, a new universe is now created, as talked about in Revelation. We begin a brand new unwritten journey in the cosmos, okay? Basically is what this means. The end is never really the end, but the start of a new journey. So it's this concept of maintaining the sanctification through this relationship with God, and we're continuing on this journey. Okay, so this pictogram is literally a symbol of God's mark, God's sign, or God's seal. Now, in Ezekiel chapter 9, verse 4 through 6, we read something very interesting about God's mark, God's seal, okay, and the Tav. So here we start with verse 4, and the Lord said unto him, so Ezekiel is going into a vision, and Ezekiel is given a vision of the last days. In other words, right before the end of the world, God gave Ezekiel a vision of what would happen prior to the destruction of the world, or prior to God coming and restoring things back in the balance, taking the righteous, okay? The Lord said to him, go through the midst of the city, through the midst of Jerusalem, and set a mark upon the foreheads of the men that sigh and that cry for all the abominations that be done in the midst thereof. So God is clearly delineating between two groups of people here. He's showing that there's going to be those who God set aside that will receive a mark on them, on their foreheads, their mind, the way they worship, the way they think about God, and separate them from others who are committing abominations, okay, those things that are detestable to God. Maybe they've broken God's 10 commandments because they worship idols, they have other gods before them, they murder, they rape, they pillage, you know, all the horrible things. They don't keep that Sabbath, that creation mark at the end of creation week. Okay, so here Ezekiel's given a vision of the last days where he says, go through the midst of the city. Now, when we're talking about the city, Jerusalem, we're talking about God's people. Okay, so in the last days, Zion, okay, those people who are going to be set aside and placed a mark on them. So what does it say next? And to the others, he said, in mine hearing, go ye after him through the city and smite. In other words, those who are wicked are going to be destroyed. And let not your eyes spare, neither have ye pity on them. Slay utterly old and young, both maids and little children and women, but come not near any man upon whom is the mark, and begin at my sanctuary. In other words, start first with the house of Israel, then extend out to the Gentiles, but everyone is going to make a choice whether they have God's seal, his mark, his sign, or those who do not have God's seal. They have the mark of the beast, okay? So here we see in Ezekiel chapter 9 a vision of something that John the Revelator went into detail on when he looked at, for example, Revelation 13, the mark of the beast, okay? And here there was no, it didn't matter if you were old or young, if you were female or male, if you were a woman, a child, if you chose not to follow God, okay, then you would not receive the mark or the seal, okay? That final completion of perfection, the sign of God, okay? So this is that concept of the Tav, where the Tav is very important. You need to have that final stamp of approval in order to make it through. Now we see this again in Revelation. So Ezekiel saw it first. John the Revelator is given that same vision again in Revelation 7, verse 1 through 3. God says, and after these things I saw 4 angels who were standing on the 4 corners of the earth. So you can almost imagine some of the scenes happening behind things happening on the planet right now, and they're holding these 4 winds of strife, okay, 4 winds of war and destruction that would come upon the earth. And God instructed the 4 angels to hold on to these 4 winds, that the wind should not blow on the earth, nor touch the sea, nor any tree. Don't destroy anything. What was he waiting for? Okay, in verse 2, he saw, God says to John, and John saw another angel ascending from the east, okay? So east to west, as lightning moves from east to west, Jesus alludes to that at his second coming. I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God. So again, this concept of the seal. So we're often told about the mark of the beast. We're often told about, 666, don't receive that. But in the Hebrew language itself, it already indicated that it was very important that you receive the seal of God. Only later, like 4,000 years later, when John got into vision, that we realized that there's a mark of the beast. But before that, everyone knew that you had to have the seal of God. So the mark of the beast came second. when the Hebrew language came out in the 10th century BC, everyone knew that you had to be marked. You had to have a covenant with God. You had to have the seal of the living God. And then John, in 70 to 100 AD, when he wrote the book of Revelation some 2,000 years ago, he reminds us of the seal, and then he gives us more insight in Revelation chapter 13 about the mark of the beast. That's the false mark, the false seal. Okay, the Antichrist and Satan. That's what they want you to have, the false, where God is saying you got to have the real seal. Okay, so that's the Tav. So after you've gone through this journey, the Tav is telling you that at the end of that thing, you have to be marked by God. You have to have his name. You have to have his signet, his seal. Okay, so we see it in Revelation chapter 7. And he cried with a loud voice to the four angels, to whom it was given to hurt the earth and the sea, saying, do not hurt the earth, neither the sea nor the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God in where? Their forehead. So exactly the same thing that Ezekiel saw. But you notice the key word in this verse is till. So in other words, the winds will let loose. There is going to be destruction. There's going to be crazy things happening on the planet, which we see right now happening. Okay, but the total destruction of the planet and the sea and the trees and the people, none of that's going to happen until people have a time to decide and choose God or not choose to receive the seal of God. Okay, so that's the key operative word here. Okay, but what's important is that the Tav only occurs at the end of that journey, which means that this is only going to happen at the end of the world, which, if it's very near, we are on that journey. Okay, and we are almost to that close. We're almost to the point where God is going to deliver the righteous, he's going to destroy the wicked, and he's going to seal those who are his, and those who choose to receive the mark of the beast will keep their mark there. Okay, so this concept of the Tav and the seal and the mark is very much related to these visions that Ezekiel saw. It was very much understood for centuries about receiving. If you want to have a relationship with God, you had to have the mark of God. Okay, and then when we got to John, as he was prophesying about the last days, it's looking forward into the future. It is exactly the same condition, the same choice. So the things that applied in the days of old, Adam and Eve and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and the children of Israel and Joshua, all the way up through the minor and the major prophets up until Jesus, that is exactly the same choice that people in the last days, you and I have. Do we receive the seal of God, or do we receive the mark of the beast? Okay, so I guess the question is what is the mark? What is the seal? Okay, so we are told Ezekiel goes back into vision, and he shows here in Ezekiel 20 verse 12, this is a very famous text. Moreover, I also gave them my Sabbaths. So at the end of creation week, God set up a memorial, a time frame, a time that God said that is going to be the Tav. It will be the sign. It'll be the mark, the seal between God and humanity. If you remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, that is the mark that you're worshiping the true Creator. This is why in the Ten Commandments, that fourth commandment, when you read it, it doesn't just say remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. It goes on and parses it out and explains it and says, because in 6 days I create. So it goes back through that creation week. So when you go to Genesis chapter 1 through 3, and you look at creation week, you realize very quickly that the Sabbath was very important, because it was a day that God rested in it. His presence came in it. It became holy, and that was the day when God would commune, and that was the sign that you worshiped the true Creator, as Ezekiel chapter 20 verse 12 said. But he goes on in even Ezekiel 20:20, and he says, I need you to hallow. And hallow is a verb. It means to make holy. You and I can't make anything holy, which means that we need God's presence. So when he says hallow my Sabbaths, it's actually telling you to come into a relationship with God, get into God's presence on that time frame that God set aside at the very beginning, and together in that relationship with God, you will have that seal, that mark, and you are keeping something holy because God's presence is holy. You and I are not holy. We can't keep anything holy. We need God's presence there. That's why it says, hallow my Sabbaths. And they will be a sign, so there you see the word again, a sign between me and you, that you may know that I am the Lord your God. So you see here, the only proof that you and I have, that we might know with confidence, that we can trust and have faith and believe, that we might know that we are worshiping the Lord, the Creator. The only way that you have, according to Ezekiel 20:20, the only proof that you have, the sign that you have, is by keeping that Sabbath. And so the Tav, at the very end of the Hebrew alphabet, it's very similar to creation week, where God created the amazing things, but at the end, at the completion of all of his work, he rested. So the Tav says, at the end of that journey of the spiritual meaning of the Hebrew alphabet, you've now come to the journey's end, and there my presence is there. Receive the mark, and then begin a brand new journey. Okay, so that's how it all ties together between the Hebrew alphabet, Genesis to Exodus to Ezekiel. Even Jesus kept the Sabbath. Isaiah says that when we get to heaven, Isaiah 66, it says that the redeemed will be keeping the Sabbaths. And then you get to Revelation. Revelation talks about, the saints are those who keep the commandments, which includes the Sabbath, and have the testimony of Jesus. So they have both. They keep the commandments and have the faith of Jesus. That's in Revelation, okay? Now that we know that the Tav is symbolic of God's mark, okay, this is literally, the pictogram means mark, sign, or seal, or this journey's end. Let's now apply what we learned to Psalm 119, verse 169 through 176. And here's what it says. May my cry come before you, Lord. So clearly David is in prayer. He's crying to the Lord, so he's in deep supplication. So in other words, he's going into this anguish moment where he realizes that he hasn't attained that journey's end yet. Okay, he hasn't come to the completion yet. So the Tav that sits over Psalm 119, verse 169 to 176, we begin by saying that while we're on this planet, we're still in this turmoil. We haven't come, but it is a message of hope. In other words, the Tav says that there will come a point when this will all end. You will receive God's mark, his sign, or his seal. You will come to the end of that journey. So David then says, help me then by giving me understanding according to the word of God. In other words, now up to that point, you remember, there was no minor prophets that were written. There was no New Testament. So David's writing the book of Psalms. So the only thing that existed really was just the first 5 books of Moses. And he's looking to the Sabbath commandment. He's looking to, in Exodus chapter 20, he's looking to Genesis and the creation week. And he's reading the scriptures there that describe, okay, the journey of the Israelites into the Holy Land, as he opens up, writings from Joshua maybe, or Ruth, and, those stories that he's heard about. But yet he knows that the story's not done yet. So he says, may my cry come before you, Lord. Help me to understand according to your word. So in other words, there's still yet much to be understood. Then he says in 170, again, may my supplication is that deep prayer mode where you're by yourself, you're crying to the Lord, you're praying for yourself, and you're supplicating with the Lord. May my supplication come before you. So David is in deep prayer with God, trying to understand, because now we're at the end of that story, okay? And then notice what he says here. That's the hope message there. Deliver me according to your promise. So you can see that this is a message of restoration, just as the Tav talked about. It is a message that at the end of that journey, there's going to be a restoration. You'll receive a mark, a sign, a seal, proof that God is alive and active, not only in the world, but in your life. And at the end of that, there's going to be deliverance, okay? Because we're still in this battle. We're still on the planet. There's still a lot of destruction, a lot of death. There's still a lot of worries and concern. But here David is saying that at the very end of that journey, the Tav says that when we receive the sign, the mark, or the seal of God, that there will be deliverance. And so verse 171, it says, then therefore may my lips overflow with praise. So the immediate response is, even though I'm here and I'm crying before the Lord, I'm still going to praise the Lord because of my understanding and what God taught me through his decrees and what God taught me through his word. And I understand that all of this, the sacrifices, all of the feasts, all the festivals, my understanding of the Hebrew alphabet is pointing me to this message of hope that it's not going to last forever, that there will be a deliverance and God will bring this to an end, and God will sign, he'll put a sign, a seal, or a mark on God's people. Okay? Then we go on. If you take a look at verse 172, he says there, let my tongue sing. So not only is my lips praising God, but from inside of me, I have joy. My tongue is singing of your word. Now remember, your word is not the New Testament. Psalms wasn't even written yet. He's talking about the commandments that Moses got and received on Mount Sinai. Okay, so he's talking about the word of God that came through Moses. So there's something hidden in the Mosaic laws. There's something hidden in those, in the sanctuary, in the tabernacle, in the desert, the feasts and festivals. There's a lot of symbols that are even giving more depth into the spiritual meaning of the Hebrew alphabet, or the Tav. Now, 173 is very important, and I put it in highlight. I said, may your hand, Lord, so it's God's work, may your hand be ready to help me. So until we get to that time of deliverance, it is God's work that is helping me keep that Sabbath, making things holy, going on my journey, so that way at the end of it, we go through the races and get these medals, right? Paul talks about going on a marathon race so you can receive your crown. Well, here David's saying at the end of your journey, at the end of your race, what you're going to get is a signet, okay? You are going to get God's name on you. You're going to have a mark or sign or seal. That is our reward, okay? But it's all done through the hand of God. Nothing that we can do. So David realizes very quickly that deliverance is not based on how much I can sing or praise, but how much God helps me, okay? And because of that, I have chosen to do God's precepts. I long for your salvation. So again, we have this deliverance message in the Tav. We have this deliverance message at the very end of Psalm 119. After we've journeyed through all of this going back and forth with this relationship with God, at the end, we're longing for that moment when everything comes to a final conclusion. We've come to the finish line, and there's salvation, there's deliverance, and God will separate his people, just as Ezekiel saw this, and just as John the Revelator saw with the sealing of his people before the four winds of strife are let loose on the earth, and then God comes again, okay? Then he concludes off and he says, until then, let me live. If I'm going to live, then I'm going to live praising God, even though I'm going through these problems, okay? And may God's law sustain me. In other words, I might be going through these struggles that puts me on my knees in supplication, and I have to cry to the Lord, but I'm still going to look forward and hope to salvation and deliverance, and I will live with praise. And why? Because I have strayed like a lost sheep. But notice here how he ends it off. He says, the end of the story is, it doesn't matter how much I've strayed as a lost sheep, God is still going to keep on seeking you. Okay? So you may have come in and out of these relationships with God, and you might continue to keep wandering away, but as soon as you turn back to God and you say, God, help me, God is there. He's going to keep seeking you, and he's going to keep bringing you in. But there's going to come a time, though, that it's all going to end. So you have to choose if you're going to receive the mark, the sign, the seal of God, or as John saw in Revelation, the mark of the beast. So he concludes and says, do not forget the commandments of God. And that's the conclusion there. So until we get to that point of the real conclusion, the Hebrew alphabet takes you to the deliverance message. It takes you to when everything comes to an end. We're not there yet. So David says, until we receive there, do not forget the commandments. Now remember, the commandments it's very clear what we're talking about. We're talking about the commandments that were given through Moses. All right, so there's something hidden in there, and later on Jesus sheds a ton of light. Paul sheds a ton of light in the New Testament that really the Ten Commandments is a mere reflection of God's character, God's law of love. Remember when the Pharisees were trying to frame Jesus and wanted to ask Jesus which was the greatest of all the commandments. And Jesus says these two: love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. On those two laws hang all the prophets and all the laws. So he's talking about Moses too. So the real motivation behind the Ten Commandments and the real motivation behind the spiritual journey that we've taken in the Hebrew alphabet is this, and that is love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself, because there's going to come a time when God is going to end it all and he's going to deliver his people. Okay? So this is the Tav, Psalm 119, verse 169 to 176. It is literally, when you look at it, it is the mark, the sign, the seal of God, the end of the human journey, and the start of a brand new journey when the end of our journey on this planet ends. When the destruction of the world, we start a brand new chapter that's not been written yet. So this is kind of exciting because the Hebrew alphabet is giving an indication that God is saying this is going to come to an end and he has something prepared, a brand new journey, and you're going to start it all over at the Aleph. Okay, so that's the actual, the meaning behind the Hebrew alphabet there, okay? So up to this point, we have taken a look at 22 different Hebrew alphabets. And as we go through these, next week I'm going to wrap up this series by going through a review of each of these Hebrew alphabets. And I'm going to go through this, and this is the thing. You don't want to miss it because this has hidden in it a golden thread. If you stand back at 30,000 feet, you're given a view of something that you don't realize. Okay, we've been looking at it at a micro level. We're going to stand back and look at it at a macro level and realize something very significant, that God just gave us some significant spiritual insight into a secret. Okay, so we're going to be taking a look at all of the pictograms together next week. But until then, Toda Rabbah, God bless everyone, and I will see you all, if not on Friday for Daniel Prophecy Seminar, I'll see you on Saturday for Revelation Prophecy Seminar, or Sunday at my regular broadcast, or if not any of those times, I'll see you next Wednesday when we conclude the spiritual meaning behind the Hebrew alphabet journey. Until then, Toda Rabbah, and God bless.